So the earliest sort of collective cooperative activities were mutual aid societies and beneficial societies. That's what I've been talking about. We did joint purchasing, revolving loan funds, sickness, widow, orphan, and death benefits. Often these were through Black religious organizations, fraternal organizations, Black-owned schools, very informal, except that it was passing of money, so there was a formality. People knew where their money was going and who. They only let trusted people hold the money until it was needed to be used. That ended up meaning often Black women were the sort of bankers for these kinds of associations. Many of them were headed by Black women, and eventually actually Black women and women's mutual aid societies became the largest form of mutual aid in the Black community. And just quickly, because I think I'm going too slowly here, I want to give an example of a mutual aid society. The Free African Society in Philadelphia in the late 1700s is the second oldest Black mutual aid association, and it started out doing burials and then death benefits and then widow and orphan programs, etc. But also the Free African Society is the one that established the first independent Black church. So again, if you're thinking about community wealth and what it means to pool resources, not just for survival, but then those pooled resources, that organization they had actually established a whole new spiritual relationship between Blacks and religion, right? And created a whole new religion. And so again, you can see the power of going from, a few people putting in a penny here, a penny there, 10 cents there to make sure their loved ones are buried properly, to establishing a whole church, which is now a huge, right? The AME system is a huge system. And again, I think I said it in the other slide, Black women ended up starting their own mutual aid societies around the country and ended up by the early 1800s being the largest group of mutual aid societies. So then let's move into co-ops. And I've got, I think, 5 ways that co-ops are community assets and create community wealth. And the mutual aid societies, many of them sort of morphed into co-ops, and sometimes it was because of people's activity in the mutual aid society that they then realized the official co-op structure would work for what they were trying to do. And so I see a kind of natural, even though mutual aid societies still exist, and actually they've been coming back in force in the last few months. But there was a sort of natural progression from the more informal mutual aid societies to the more formal co-ops, especially once the US passed laws for how to incorporate as a co-op. The co-ops proliferated in Black communities. So the first ways that co-ops are community wealth agents are that they anchor. I think I hinted at that earlier. They anchor resources and people in communities. So they're institutions of what we call the solidarity economy that's there for people, not for profits, and that's controlled by local people, right? We start co-ops because there's a need, and people need to come together to satisfy that need because the other forms of economic development aren't doing it, right? And then because the co-ops are about local people coming together, pooling resources and solving local problems, and because of their longevity, they're really anchoring capital and production into a local community. One example, 1901, the Oddfellows Lodge, which is basically a fraternal organization, but it was also a mutual aid society, established the Mercantile Cooperative Company in Ruthville, Virginia. It was basically a store, a department store, produce and a supply store. They sold shares, $5 each. So $5 was a lot in 1901, but it was also an important way to pool resources so they could afford to have the things in the store that they needed. They didn't want anyone to feel like they had more control over the co-op, so no one could buy more than 20 shares. But they also allowed people to pay in installments, since $5 was a lot at that time. You didn't have to pay it all at once, so that anybody could join and be a member, even if they couldn't afford the price at the beginning. They bought trucks as a cooperative and shared the machinery. So in addition to having a supply store, They did a what's called the machine co-op, sharing machinery. They also built a school so they could have an independent school. Again, 1901, the height of Jim Crow era. So the black public schools were inferior and segregated. So they built their own black independent school based on what was happening through the cooperative. That co-op lasted, and that co-op society lasted for over 20 years. So again, longevity. And one of the studies about it talks about how important that level of economic independence was that the co-op provided. It actually raised the standard of living for the blacks in that county in Virginia, so that their standard of living was actually higher than the whites. And it also aided them in the 40s and 50s in the struggle for political rights and racial justice, because they already had this history of collectivism, cooperativism, as well as a higher standard of living. And so that's one of the examples of a cooperative, and you can see sort of the community wealth aspects of it, as well as the other things it was doing. In the 30s, there's a proliferation of cooperatives for everybody, but especially in the Black community, I found. And we use cooperatives in general for needed goods and services, addressing unemployment and poverty, replacing investment where our communities had been disinvested, and addressing the multiple issues of the Depression. So again, this is a good, these examples I'm going to show you are good models for what we could be doing now, the similar situation as the Great Depression. And can somebody give me a 5-minute warning so I know when I need to either speed up or change tactic? So one of the 30s co-ops was in Gary, Indiana, what, down the street from you guys, or a few hundred miles? From at least those of you who are in Indianapolis. It's one of my favorite examples, so some of you may have heard it already, but Consumer Cooperative Trading Company actually started out with a study group at the height of the Great Depression. The last bank had left the neighborhood, and the Black community was in dire straits, and they came together to start to talk about what was happening. They created a course on cooperatives. They learned everything they could, and they decided they wanted a grocery store, a gas station, and a credit union. And so they opened their first co-op in 1935 after over a year and a half of studying cooperatives and trying to figure out, right, what to do. I think they had a little bit of a buying club first, and then they opened the grocery store. Within a year, that grocery store was so well used, it became the largest African-American grocery store in the United States, with total sales of $160,000. This is 1936, people. So it was well used, it was well operated, it brought in revenues, brought important food and access to food that wasn't there. And because it was a co-op, they started giving annual dividends back to every member of 2% on your initial equity. And so not only did it provide all the things we know the grocery stores provide in an affordable way, it also was giving back dividends. So that's also a kind of wealth, and giving dividends to the members. I forgot how many members were in this co-op, but it was in the hundreds. And then they also, within another year, they added a credit union because they realized the control over financial services was important. A second grocery store, a branch grocery store, since the grocery store had gotten very big, and a gas station because access to gas was also another problem. So here's a group that tried to solve all of their local community problems with the co-op ownership. And they considered their women's guild also continued to study throughout the whole process to keep everybody on their toes and keep current on how to run a co-op properly. In North Carolina, there were two independent Black schools, Terrell County School and Bricks School, that worked together to create a North Carolina council. First, they did an Eastern Regional Council where they were in North Carolina, and then they made a national council. The two schools had gotten into co-op education and were teaching the adults, not just the children, about co-ops, and the adults were starting ag co-ops and a credit union, etc. They also, both schools started a co-op health insurance program to make sure they had a nurse and a way to pay for hospitalization, all again during the Great Depression. Then they realized they needed a coalition, and so they came together with other Black co-ops and then with the state agricultural department to create manuals and workshops so they could promote the development of Black credit unions and co-ops. And by the time they finished the manual in 1936, within 12 years, they had gone from 3 Black credit unions to 98 Black credit unions in the state of North Carolina. And they also added 48 additional Black co-ops from that. So again, here's again where one co-op didn't just do it by themselves. They joined together, they got state support. They also both, the health insurance, the co-op health insurance is very important, especially for nowadays. Both of them use the co-ops as a kind of mutual aid to do health insurance. The one at Bricks actually decided they needed a full-time nurse, so they raised money to pay a full-time nurse. They only raised half the money. They were able to leverage that with the state health department, and the state health department matched the money they had raised so that they could have a full-time nurse. So that's what I also talk about leveraging, right? You do for yourselves, you do as much as you can, and then you can often leverage what you've pooled, leverage the agency that you started and get something bigger out of it. And then more recently in the 60s, and Freedom Quilting Bee, I think still exists now, but it's existed for about 30 years, if not longer. Started in 1967, sharecropping women needed extra income. Sharecropping is not, is debt peonage. It's not very lucrative. They started a sewing cooperative to sew and sell quilts for extra money. Within about 4 or 5 years, they had enough money to buy land and build a sewing plant, so they didn't have to do their quilts at home. They could do them in a factory. Once they were now working away from home, they needed childcare and other services, so they started a childcare center and after-school program. Because of the 23 acres of land they had a lot of independence. They also helped other sharecroppers to own land by selling them some of the acres they had bought, because often whites wouldn't sell blacks land. But also they were helping sharecroppers because many of them were evicted from the sharecropping land they were on if they registered to vote. And so then they would let them either rent some of their land or they would sell their land to them. And again, this gave them some independence so they could do whatever they wanted in terms of registering to vote. They were the largest employer in their town by 1992. They had a little bit of a turnover problem as some of their original members got old. And so for a while, the company went into hiatus, but it came back in the early 2000s. And I think it's still existing. Also, some of the quilts from that co-op ended up in an exhibit, the Gee's Bend quilting exhibit in the Smithsonian. So there's also a whole connection with arts, as well as this economic and political independence that was so needed. Recirculating resources, I think you get the idea about that, how co-ops have, keep the resources recirculating in a community. That's another reason why I call them community wealth agents. Because they buy local wages are used locally, surplus is returned to members who live locally. So that's the notion of circulation and recirculation, right? How much, if you spend a dollar in a co-op, how much of that dollar stays in the community, right? Well, most of it does. If you spend a dollar in a Walmart, maybe 1 penny stays in the community and all the rest of the money goes to the Walmart owners and the Walmart headquarters, etc. There was a study done a couple of years ago about how food co-ops spend more revenues locally. They buy more products locally. They buy more organic products. They recycle more. They create more jobs in conventional grocery stores. And for every $1,000 spent at a food co-op, $1,600 goes to the local economy. So that food co-op, it's not just recycling. It's actually creating more capital in the co-op. And for every $1 million in sales, 9.3 jobs are created by food co-ops. So it's another example of the ways that co-ops create community wealth and keep and bring wealth into neighborhoods.